Hello, folks. Welcome back to the Great Future Sports. I'm your host, Ameer Washington. And today we are recording episode 5 of the Great Future Sports with a special guest, one of our wellness coordinators who will introduce to you later. We're going to do a little bit of housekeeping and say, please hit subscribe, smash the like button, helps us with the algorithm. Got to get those views. And one day we'll, get more views because of you. So, this conversation is very important to us because it's a key component of our work in the wellness space, and a lot of it is centered around what we call trauma-informed care, and we're going to dive deep into that with our current guest, and I'm going to let her introduce herself to you.
Hi, everyone. I'm Kimberly Alfonso. I am a licensed social worker by trade and here at the Boys and Girls Club for the last 3 years. My 3-year anniversary was on the 17th of March. I have been the wellness coordinator. Yep.
Thanks, Kim. I'm sorry to interrupt you, but you said the word that I'm very interested in, or 2 words that I'm very interested in, is social worker. Mm-hmm. And so it's a title or a job pursuit that a lot of people have, but what does it really mean to be a social worker? Because I think there's different ways to define it.
I think that probably to society, social workers come off as people who take your kids away. Because I think there's just this negative connotation of the folks that work at DCP&P who do amazing work. Do that type of work sometimes, but social workers are much more than that, and social workers can be in any space, truly. And I think I learned that more in graduate school because I had that same connotation when I was in undergrad. I wasn't sure, and when I learned that social workers could be therapists, they could work in policy, they could be mayors, they could be the president if they wanted to. It opened up a lot of avenues for not only myself, but I think just when people had asked me oh, what made you go into social work? I was like, well, because of the broad things that you could do. So if you wanted to be a therapist, there's maybe 2 avenues, a licensed professional counselor, or you can go the social worker route. With the social worker route, you have that ability to kind of work in any setting. So hospitals, private practices and everything. Whereas licensed professional counselors are kind of more niched to private practices or clinics, mental health spaces, where social worker can kind of be in any space, like schools, anything like that. Yeah. So I think it's just a bigger field than I think people expect it to be.
Yeah, that's it. I think that's important because I think sometimes, depending on the space or work that you're in, a social worker is defined as such. I know for me, a lot of them do case management. Mm-hmm. And so, if we take out, let's say, the dark side of DCP&P, which is to take kids in harmful situations from their parents and their family, what would you say, I guess, what is the benefit of a social worker for anybody?
I would say just the holistic approach that social workers take. I think a lot of social workers come from the same aspect that everything impacts the person. It's not just one thing. It's so to say, we're kind of looking at the whole environment. So I think a big theory in social work is person and environment, that the environment really impacts the person. And that's true because as we know of nature versus nurture, everyone knows that. Mm-hmm. Someone could be raised in the same exact space, or they could be raised, let's say 2 twins. One could be adopted and be in a rich, wealthy 1% family and the other in maybe a different poorer or whatever the case may be. And they might be raised differently, but they'll still have those same biological makeups that might impact, right? So I think it's important to kind of see that double aspect, and I think social workers do that better than probably other fields. I think doctors are going to go in and just go medical, whereas a social worker, even as a therapist, I can focus on just the diagnosis that this person has, but there's kind of layers to it that we have to address before we even get there.
Okay. So I think she's gone somewhere, which is this concept. I'm actually going to jump ahead of my questions because it's a term that we use a lot. It's called trauma-informed care. And I think a lot of people get stuck on the word trauma and think largely about trauma as something bad that happened to you. And I think that's accurate to a large extent. But explain the concept of trauma-informed care. What does that mean? Deconstruct that whole 3-word umbrella, so to speak.
Yeah, if we look at it word by word, so I think everyone knows what trauma means. I don't think I have to just describe what trauma is. But if we think about the word informed and then care, you want to be informed about what someone has gone through to be able to provide them with the accurate care that they need. So at least here at the Boys and Girls Club, when we talk about trauma-informed care, we're creating a whole and type of environment down from our policies to how we train our staff on ensuring that we are aware of some of the things that our kids, our families are going through so that we can provide them with a safe trusting environment and also not re-traumatize them through that process. So I think it's nice to kind of break it down just by the 3 words, because if you're not informed of certain things, how can you accurately help? Yeah, right. So like, I think when you look at the word in that sense, it's really just about understanding everything about this person. What have they gone through that impacted them to get to this point? And how can we then shift the environment or shift the staff practices that we do to make sure that we don't re-traumatize in the process?
Okay. And so the other buzz phrase or word setup is social emotional learning. So that's both on the staffing side as well as, children and other people who are being served. What does that all mean?
Social emotional learning, or SEL, is really just about the teachings of like coping skills, relationship skills, just emotional awareness, like the language around it. Because a lot of us don't grow up learning like to say like, I feel disappointed. You might just say like, I feel sad. And there's layers to emotions that I think a lot of people don't realize, especially that 2 emotions can exist at once.
Right.
And that you can be mad and happy at the same time, or you could be grieving and happy at the same time. Hold on.
Go ahead. You can be mad and happy at the same time.
Yeah.
You could be grieving and happy at the same time.
Yeah.
So let's dig into that a little bit, because that right, most people would hear that and go, that makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. So how does that actually play out when you're talking to someone about that and kind of making them make sense of it?
Well, depends on the person. I think an easier way to
that would be trauma-informed care.
Exactly.
Depends on the person. So it's really right.
Everyone is different.
Personally centered.
I think a lot of the times I hear staff being like, well, I want to treat all my kids fairly and the same. And that's a beautiful thing. You do want to treat everyone the same. But if someone has different needs or has been through something different, we can't necessarily treat them the same.
Right.
We have to meet them where they are to get them to the level of, and that's equity, right? Like we have to give people what they need to get to the level of everyone else. I just think that at least here we do a really good job of ensuring that our staff understands that every kid is different and they need certain things, and not every kid is gonna be a normal kid, I guess. And that we need to ensure that we're meeting them where they are and understanding, building a relationship with them to really understand what they're being impacted outside of the club. So like, for example, a kid who maybe has a parent who's never home, works a lot, or in the military, let's just say, and then that parent comes home, we might see a change in their behavior because there's a completely new person in the house. Despite that being a parent that they've known that they had, it's going to completely disrupt their regulation because now this other person is coming in, and maybe child and mom, if that was the person who was home, had a routine, and then dad comes back and kind of impacts the whole thing. And then now this child is now dysregulated. So then we have to understand, now we have this kid come to the club and they're dysregulated here. And we're like, what happened? Little Johnny was fine last week.
Right.
And then we find out a parent is back in the home, or maybe a sibling is back from college, or whatever the case may be. And it's disrupted the whole thing. Yeah. So I think it's having those understandings of, okay, these things happen, behaviors change or emotions change. And then we have to kind of shift from there. And even with like the double emotions happening at the same time, like a kid might be so happy that their parent is back, but maybe they're also a little bit nervous that that parent is back because maybe they don't have that best relationship with them. So you can kind of navigate 2 emotions at once.
Yeah.
But it's kind of, you kind of have to regulate one at a time, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that makes sense to me. But I was going to go back to that question, but you answered it. And so it's kind of like, I can be happy, but I can also be nervous about this person being there. And
anxiety is not always a bad thing either. So like, one thing I always like to say is like, are we having anxiety that's going to debilitate us, or are we having anxiety that's actually going to motivate us?
Right.
Because we can have that anxiety of like presenting, or like had anxiety about being on this podcast, right? But at the same time, it's like an exciting anxiety rather than like, oh my God, I can't do this type of thing.
And we were talking about this before we started, that Kim's always been behind the camera on this podcast, helping out, right? Because we don't have a huge staff or anything. But I want to go into another 3-word acronym that you brought up during this conversation that has been a buzz for many years, but I think I would say in the last 7 years has really kind of been the highlight. And with the most recent political changes in our federal government, it's now started to change and shift again. And I don't know that your definition will satisfy anyone, or that someone else who's a social worker, mental health professional, might have a different definition of this, but the words have been put together again: diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Yeah.
And one of the things I struggle with, in my role as CEO and learning about these things is the differences in how they're viewed, and then how they're viewed depending on the scenario.
Mm-hmm.
So can you help us better understand diversity, equity, inclusion, perhaps in your, deconstructing the term together as one individual word, and then kind of how that all plays together?
When it comes to DEI work, I think it's just about, again, I think the underlying of it, for me at least, and I can't really speak to the whole entire profession because I think there's social workers that have various point of views.
Right.
But I think the underlying is that trauma-informed, understanding that, everyone, regardless of socioeconomic status, ethnic background, anything, something has happened that is going to impact you, whether it's, the most traumatic thing to, on the spectrum, right? Maybe abuse to, maybe just, a traumatic, accident. You know what I mean? And that we have to have an understanding that DEI is going to be everywhere, and we need to be aware of these things and the history behind why those things were put in place.
Right.
I don't want to get too political about it.
Let's not go deep. Let's not go political whatsoever. We are an apolitical organization. We like everybody in our government who supports kids and Boys and Girls Club.
I think when it comes to the youth specifically with DEI, I think it's just having that understanding that our youth are gonna, one, they're super aware of the changes, especially our teens. I have not had more impactful conversations, especially with our teens here, about the political environment and how that's impacting them. It has been an eye-opener for even our 13, 14, 15, 16-year-olds to be I know if this is taken away, my opportunities might be a little bit more limited because of just where I'm from or what school I went to and all that stuff. Right. So I think there's an understanding that things are going to change and that they're going to be impacted, whether it's positively or negatively.
Sure. So let's go into the terms individually. So diversity is what? What when we talk about diversity, what does that mean?
I would say diversity is more about understanding that everyone is different. Mm-hmm. We're all diverse types of people, whether it's personality and coming from different backgrounds. This is a melting pot here. We are all different here, and we're all coming from different places. And I think having an understanding of people, in the social work world, we call it cultural competency. So you want to be aware of different cultures to then help practice with people, because I'm Cuban, you're something else. We have different upbringings, and how we were raised is going to impact our interactions with people just based on things that we learned. So when you're culturally competent, or that you're not culturally competent about a certain culture, you can go and research to ensure that you have awareness. Let's say we know, well, I know in the Asian culture, they don't look adults really, men specifically, children won't look them in the eyes. Someone might think that as disrespectful, right? Not understanding what that culture is. Right. So if we have that understanding, we cannot maybe take that personally, or we can be building that trust where they might feel comfortable to eventually do that. If that shows a sign of, active listening, things like that.
Right.
So I think with diversity, it's really understanding that we're all different and that we all bring things differently to whatever the space is. And I feel usually with DEI, we're thinking about corporate world or things like that, but that's going to impact the place of environment. And if people don't like each other because of those things, that's also going to cause a rift. So I think it's just having an understanding that we're all different. We all bring different things to the table, and that should be respected at the end of the day.
Yeah. So equity is, it's not private equity or anything like that. But equity, I think, is confusing for people because most people were brought up in the idea of equality, right? And so the civil rights movement, the negative parts of America's history was equality, equality, equality. And then we've had these discussions about equality of opportunity, equality of outcomes, and the equity sits somewhere along the spectrum of these conversations. How do you define that word, around these concepts for people to kind of understand what equity means when you're serving a person?
I think equity means meeting the person where they are and establishing practices that's going to help them achieve those goals the same way maybe a normal person would achieve those goals. I have an image in my head that I've seen on, of course, social media, and it's speaking about equity and how let's say the picture is like little kids like watching a baseball game for some reason, like behind a fence,
right.
and all the kids that are taller can like peek over the fence to see, and then there's one kid in a wheelchair. So then you kind of like slide to the next post, and then that little person on a wheelchair is now like lifted up by like a box with all of their friends. So like that's equity. Like we found a way to make this little person be able to see like everyone else.
Right.
Because even though they have a disadvantage of not being able, being in a wheelchair, right? They're still able to meet that goal of watching that game with the rest of their friends because we had put something in place for them to reach it.
So it's like putting a person who has a challenge in a position where they have the best vantage point to view the game so that they see it within this, let's say, the same high definition as everyone else.
Exactly.
So it doesn't necessarily, it creates an equality within the moment, but they're still disabled.
Right.
Like it doesn't change how they operate within the world, but we create platforms for them to be able to experience things the same way that other people do.
Exactly.
And why we have the Special Olympics and not just the Olympics, so that those people can have an opportunity to play sports and be rewarded on a big international stage. So the last word, which I think is probably just as difficult as the others. In some ways. I think diversity is easy. I think people understand that. I think equity people struggle with because it's kind of like the whole merit versus everybody gets a trophy concept.
Yes.
But inclusion, and I think this is probably where a lot of the challenges come. How do we define inclusion and make people comfortable with the concept of inclusion?
Ooh, loaded question.
I know. It's what we do at the Great Futures Force.
I would say making people comfortable with inclusion is an individual journey, I think.
I like that response because I have another question that kind of...
Because not everyone is going to, again, based on their upbringing and all the things that have impacted them, they might not be okay with inclusion.
Interesting. You're going. Keep going. You're going exactly where I want you to go. Because I think it's a difficult concept overall, and I think it plays into how, I guess, social environments, elevate or transition or change over time.
Correct.
So let's just go to it.
Yeah.
This is my question. Why don't these programs, often when they're implemented in corporate environments, in organizational settings, why don't they ultimately work? And I think you were kind of going to that place. Because
not everyone is open to it.
Right.
Like, I think that's just like period at the end. I don't think people are open to understanding others. They maybe just don't have the capacity to. I don't think I think in corporate settings, I think there's a lot of political things that happen where it's like, why? Like asking whys for like very different reasons rather than like, oh, like this person got a raise because they're a good worker, or it could be undertoned with something else.
Right.
So I don't think they work because I don't think people are open to them all the time, or they're not being driven like correctly, I guess, if that makes sense. And I don't know exactly how it looks everywhere, but at least like, I think with Boys and Girls Club specifically, I think we try our best to make sure that people have an understanding of what inclusion is and how our staff can implement those practices to be as inclusive as possible. And I don't think you can't, at the end of the day, you're not going to make everyone happy.
Can't.
It's
impossible.
It's really impossible. But I think you can do your best to listen to the feedback and try to adjust if necessary. So like, for example, if we got feedback that like parents wish that we had a different communication, like, okay, we'll take that feedback and do our best to implement something, but someone might hate that system. So like, I think either way, you're not gonna, not everyone's gonna be happy.
So here's the thing. Cause I think you said it, right?
Yeah.
I think it's the old concept of you can try to do everything you can for everyone, but you can't satisfy everybody.
No.
So here's another thing, right? Because there's another term, and I don't think we need to go deeply into it, which is ACEs. Because I think, here's my question for you as a social worker, as a mental health professional. Do all of these ideas or statements or perspectives or initiatives, DEI, trauma-informed care, ACEs, social emotional learning, let's say these tons and tons of words together that ultimately are trying to help you serve an individual, are these things creating challenges for people to understand it, or are people just getting to places at the time that they get to them and we can't rush through certain things?
I think people just get to them when we get to them. But I do think that it is an overload of information sometimes that I think it just it's heavy stuff. Like ACEs in general literally means adverse childhood experiences,
Right.
which ultimately, if like want to boil it down, it's like trauma, abuse, any like neglect that as a child has gone through, poverty, all that stuff. So like it's heavy stuff to just like talk about. So I think people stay away from it because it's heavy, or they probably have their own underlying trauma that they don't want to address. Which I find that happens a lot. It's like people are avoiding the conversations because they're like, oh, well, I went through that. And they've conditioned themselves for so long to think like, well, I went through it and I got through it. It's okay. Yeah, and of course it's okay. We're so happy you're resilient. However, we should acknowledge that you went through those things. So I think people just get to it when they get to it.
It's like an unaddressed problem until it boils over to the point where it has to be addressed, or because it almost creates another negative or adverse experience, not necessarily childhood, but
like in relationships.
And one of the things we'll jump into kind of is like, here's a question, because we watch some reality television.
We love reality TV.
I don't love it. I like it.
I love it.
I'm not putting it I don't love it. I think it's good, problematic, but with reality television, and I think it's kind of, I don't know, it came before social media. Mm-hmm. But what are these kinds of programs like, let's say, Temptation Island, Love is Blind, Ultimatum, or social media kind of, how does that play into people's thought processes around relationships, around how they show up, around dealing with their own trauma? Are these things helpful or are they detrimental?
I think it depends on how reality TV probably could be detrimental if you're like taking advice from some of these people. But in terms of social media, it really just depends on how you use the tool. Mm-hmm. So like let's say someone who's experiencing anxiety might find a post that's really helpful on social media, but then they might also be on TikTok and then just having an overload of like people actually having panic attacks on their feeds because these people want to show the real side of themselves, right? But that could be triggering to somebody. So it's really about navigating social media and unfortunately the algorithm to make sure that you're not being overloaded with whatever is going to continue to keep you in that negative space for yourself, whatever that may be.
Yeah.
So
here's a politically, I guess, or corporately loaded question. Do you think social media platform, once called Twitter, now called X, now there's TikTok, there's Instagram, there's Facebook. I don't think most of these things were built with the idea of being negative platforms for people's feelings. From your perspective, personally, do you think it is beneficial to have them or not? And then the second question is, to what degree, if any, should the companies be held accountable for what kind of content is out there?
Mm-hmm. I like this question. Yes, I think companies should be held accountable. However, parents also need to be accountable too, especially when it comes to children, because you should be monitoring what your kids are doing on social media. I know it's not a perfect world where we can monitor every single thing our teenagers are doing, or even as young as, kids that are like 5 have iPads, you know what I mean? So like, I think it depends on the parent also. But I don't think it's so detrimental. I really just think it's how you're using it and how often you're using it. I think social media could be a wonderful tool for people in marketing, for people in, even therapists themselves are online, like showing what they do, talking about certain theories, like just basically providing psychoeducation on a social media platform, which I think could be really, really helpful. However, then on the flip side, there's a whole other world of social media out there. So I really do think it's about, one, how you as an adult, if you're an adult on social media, how are you navigating it? What's your relationship with social media? Because I think we know that the research holds that too much time on social media is going to impact your mental health. We all know that. So I think it's really just about navigating it personally. And then if you're a parent, how are you navigating that? And how are you also teaching your children safety online too?
Yeah. So should I think it's a conversation that's been up, especially with everything around TikTok. Should it be relegated then, or regulated rather, like alcohol and tobacco? Should kids not be able to use social media? Should it wait? Should they have to wait until the prefrontal cortex is developed, which is like after 24, 25, depending on the person? Should it be 18 years old, like the right to vote? But now, kids have the right to vote in some smaller local or school board elections at 16. Is there a point where it's better to introduce it as opposed to say 5, 6, or 7 years old?
I would think so. I think just developmentally, I think kids should have a time to be kids and not be so honed in on social media. I just to bring up another show, I just finished watching Adolescence on Netflix, 4-part series that was shot in one take for every episode. Really, really phenomenal acting, but it is about a young boy who is accused of murdering a classmate. He's 13. She's, I believe, 2 years older than him, so I would say 15. And he gets caught on camera, stabbing this girl multiple times. Yeah. And the premise of the show isn't about if he did it. It's the why he did it. Absorbing all of this, unfortunately, misogynistic things on social media. And because this young girl turned him down, he felt like he had the right to kill her. So I think, again, and the parent, and then you get this whole episode of just the parents, and they're so distraught, and they're basically oh my God, we failed this kid. How did we fail him? He was in his room the whole time safe. We thought we were keeping him safe. We have to keep them safe online too. Yeah. Again, just showing how the impact of social media has on our kids. And I think it could be helpful. Kids are able to, navigate technology. Some kids know how to use the phone better than I do these days. And they're probably going to all be tech geniuses and probably could make another Apple, but we have to make sure that we're keeping them safe online, and what they're absorbing isn't really impacting their decision making. Right. Because like you said, their prefrontal cortexes aren't developed
at all.
So they can't make those informed decisions without the help of the adults around them.
So you bring up a good subject in this, which is developmental stages. Mm-hmm. What we, I guess, wrestled with for, when we started going into this work called wellness, was there's a 5-year-old or 6 or 7-year-old kid, and they're acting out, and something's going on, and they're brought to the social worker, and the social worker goes, oh, well, he's just 5, right? How do we help parents understand what is 5-year-old, 6-year-old, 7-year-old kind of normal developmental behavior, and when they should be concerned about taking their kid to see a professional?
It all lies, at least for me as a provider, it all lies in the patterns. So let's say, once in a blue moon, your 5-year-old is having tantrums or having big emotions for fair reasons. Maybe their toy broke or something like that. A sibling didn't share with them. Once in a while is okay. But if you're saying no because they want to turn the oven on and then they have a tantrum, and that's something continuous, or little things, it's almost like they don't have the ability to understand the why. And at 5, you do have the ability to technically do that. So you want to be able, if once the pattern happens, let's say it's happening almost every day for a month, then I would say, okay, let's time to look further into this. Once in a blue moon or twice a week is pretty typical for a 5-year-old. Or cognitively, if you're telling your child, okay, when they're waking up, they're in kindergarten around this time, they should be able to wake up, follow a routine, brush your teeth, put your clothes on, have some breakfast, let's get out the door. If they're able to do that pretty fairly quickly or little bit redirection, they are 5, that's normal. But if they're completely disregarding you and doing other things, and this is a continuous thing, then we might have to look further because they can't even follow the routine. And at their level, developmental level, they should be able to do that as per the research. Not I think everyone's different, but as per the research, they should be able to do that. So I think it really is about the patterns rather than it happening once and people panicking, which I think happens often with parents in general because it's their kids and they're what's going on? Yeah. And it's also about how the parents are able to regulate themselves too, which I think has a big impact on that.
Okay, so that's another topic. But how does a parent learn about it? Where do they go? Are there resources that they can easily get to say, okay, if your child's experiencing X, Y, or Z, look at this, and then go here?
I would say the first step is always go to the PCP, the primary care physician. They're always going to be able to refer you to different programs, whether it's parenting programs, therapists, things of that nature. The hospitals also do a lot of programming as well. So I feel like the PCP is always the best starting place, especially because they will also screen for certain mental health challenges like depression, anxiety, things like that. Maybe not for 5-year-olds, but some older kids. So I feel like that's always a good place to start, especially for parents, because that's also a little bit easier than being I'm going to call the first therapist I see on my insurance. They probably have a relationship with their PCP already, with their child's physician. So it's just a little bit of an easier conversation, and you kind of want to ease to it if that's what you're looking for. Okay. So, and I would say the schools too.
So when can kids start learning these things? Like, is it an age where they should understand certain things about themselves, or do you leave that to the parents and the caregivers?
No, I think kids eventually start learning about themselves probably much younger than we even realize as adults. I think that they have little brains, they know they're aware of their identities. And I think society is what really shapes how we express ourselves and how we end up really being able to navigate that as we get older. But kids know themselves probably a little bit better than we
give them credit for.
Yeah,
for sure.
Yeah.
So how does Boys and Girls Club of Newark, you guys in the Wellness Center, deal with the child? What resources do you utilize to kind of say, okay, this kid is having these kinds of challenges. Here's what we're going to do for them.
Well, one thing I love about here is we do go off of a tiered approach. So at the tier 1 level, that's kind of every staff can implement these practices. So that's relationship building trust, safety, providing choice to some of our members, because sometimes that's really what it is. They're just they just don't want to do the certain activity. So okay, well, if you want to do this first, then maybe try this. So I think it's about just having those little recommendations. Plus we also have sensory spaces. So we, our kids can come and take some sensory breaks if they need, which happens a lot. I think our kids get easily overstimulated, to a fault of social media, I would say. Which, me too, though. I get it. Sometimes I find myself watching a show that's an hour long and I'm like, oh my God, this is so long. But then I realized that I was scrolling on TikTok for also an hour. So I'm like, okay. So I get it. But we end up, and then in that tier 2 as well, besides sensory spaces, we have interns that come in, which I think they do a lot of our legwork of providing psychoeducation to our kids. And I think that's kind of the biggest step here is having almost a baseline of our kids having understanding of social emotional awareness. So how can I express myself healthfully where I'm not yelling, screaming, or maybe saying something mean to somebody else just because I'm frustrated. So they have more language around their emotions, because I also find with these younger generations, because of social media, they often go for very, very negative language or something that's so disconnected to what they're actually feeling. So if they're frustrated, we'll hear I'm just going to kill myself. And you're like, whoa, hold on. What do you mean by that? And they're like, well, I wouldn't actually. I'm just so frustrated. I'm like, well, then we have to learn how to say that in a different way. Okay. It's too much of an extreme to be saying that, but it's so societal, society has accepted that for so long that we haven't really broke out of it, or a lot of the which is probably a good and a bad thing. Some buzzwords that come from social media, like narcissist, gaslight, all those things. It's really teaching our members and our kids and the youth and families, what do these words really mean? Right. Not just what this
because a narcissist is not what people common.
Exactly. So, not as common as people think that everyone is a narcissist.
So help us with it, because I think that's important, because I think one of the things, definitely, right, there's a wealth of information out there. Yes. And to your point earlier, it can be beneficial if you use it for the right thing, but it can also be detrimental because, a 13-year-old has as much access to information as Albert Einstein had.
Yes.
And probably 10 times more information. What is a narcissist? How is a narcissist truly defined, and how do people really spot what a narcissist is instead of labeling anybody who thinks highly of themselves or who's maybe arrogant or overconfident or confident as a narcissist?
I think one thing I will say about narcissists is they truly do live double lives in a sense. So someone who has confidence, maybe is a little bit arrogant, but is still able to hold healthy relationships and be able to navigate the world in a healthy way. Whereas, for example, not depending on other people to lift themselves up, because narcissists can be confident and they can be arrogant, but they use their relationships to boost themselves up, which is why narcissists usually find themselves in relationships with people who have insecure attachments or avoidant attachments, because those people are going to want to be reassured by the narcissist. So that's just feeding the narcissist ego even more. And there's also just a grandiosity about narcissists, that it's bigger than just confidence.
So, we've talked about a number of things. What is the challenge of the work of a social worker, or you and your role? What do you find is the biggest challenge? We talk about social media a lot, so I'm sure that's a challenge.
Yeah.
But what are the other things that present challenges in how you are able to help someone?
I think a big challenge is people's unwillingness to let go of certain things. And what I mean by let go, it's not forget and move past your stuff. It's more like letting go of the shame, and the like, shame is probably the biggest word, because I find that a lot of people who come in, kids included, there's just shame around their behavior, shame around certain decisions that they made based on society or family or all that stuff. So it's really about like giving yourself grace. And I find that people are so hard on themselves, kids including, because now not only are they hard on themselves, but then they have a parent who's also probably being a little hard on them too. So that's definitely a challenge. And I would say, working with kids specifically, it's getting the parents to realize that they have a big job in this. It's not just the child. So like, the child could be coming for individual therapy or coming to see one of our wellness interns, or, you know, just having a wellness break. But if the parent also isn't taking the time to reflect or do these things at home, it's kind of hard to have things change.
Right.
Because the kid's not going to be able to, like a 7-year-old, maybe a teenager could be able to do it on their own, because they're at that age where they're probably in their own routine. But like a 7-year-old who's having behavioral challenges or emotional disruption isn't going to be able to do that without that co-regulation piece.
Right.
And what I find is that a lot of parents aren't able to regulate themselves, which makes it very difficult for them to teach their child how to regulate.
So there are a number of challenges. There's the kid themselves, potentially the parents' own traumas and issues, their adverse child experiences, and then whether they're engaged enough to actually help the child, you know, get to the place they need to get. So how do you know when you have success, right? Because kids develop from, you know, the time they're born all the way through adulthood. What does success look like in your work?
Differently in every case. I would say for me, it's when I hear kids say, you know, I was able to make a better decision, or even being able to use better language around their emotions. For me, that's a win. Okay. Regardless if it's happening every single day or happening once every month, that's still a win.
Right.
I think as a society, we hone in on a lot of the negatives always, and we never really think of those positives, or we're looking for 100% success, when really sometimes it's about that 25%, and we have to recognize.
Let's talk about that. So is it social media, the internet, the perception that's created by people that everyone's always looking for? I say for everything to be perfect before they can make a decision to move.
Say that again.
Like, so let's say somebody wants to do something. Let's use marriage as a point, or a relationship. They want it to be 100% perfect before they are willing to move forward.
Impossible.
But where is this coming from?
I think just as a society, we don't like delayed gratification. We want the gratification right away. And I think that comes with the easy scroll. Like, oh, if I don't like this, I could just scroll to the next thing. I think a lot of it has to do with that. I think we've shifted from allowing kids to learn, like you said, everyone gets a trophy type of thing. Yes, that's beautiful and that's wonderful, but we also have to remember, like, these are teachable moments. How do we grow people's perspectives? How do we get them to have a growth mindset rather than fixed mindset? Because when we do that, when we give everyone a trophy, we almost keep them in that fixed mindset of being like, oh, well, I'm going to get a trophy anyway, so I don't have to do any more. Where you want them in the growth mindset of being like, oh, I did this and I could have done this to be a little bit better, or change that, or like make a better decision. So like having that like growth mindset is kind of where we want kids to be. And I think we've kind of kept them in a fixed state because of worries of other things like bullying and all that stuff. Bullying is a natural thing that happens with kids. I don't think I can think of any generation that didn't go through bullying. I think it's just gotten progressively worse because of the technology we have. We as adults have to navigate that for our kids and be able to protect our kids in terms of like teaching them conflict resolution, teaching them like how to be kind to each other on social media. And that's one thing I think I see here is we're not always so kind, our youth, like with each other. And it's like so crazy when I hear some of the things that they say to one another. I'm like, where is this coming from? And they're just like, I just felt like I had to say it. And I'm like, whoa, like, but why?
Right.
Like, and they don't really have a reason. It's almost just like, it's kind of just what I felt like. And there's no, they don't like to be redirected in that way either. Like, well, we could have said something kinder. And they're like, well, who cares? So I'm like, well, the other person probably cares.
So it sounds like the challenge, I guess, is we had a traditional environment. I think that's the word people use a lot 50, 60, 70 years ago, this
Yes.
is how this was done. And then as time progressed and we learned things, we knew that there were certain things we should change, had to change. My perspective is sometimes, to your point around delayed gratification, we try to change things too fast before people are prepared to make the changes themselves.
I would agree.
So if you could change one thing about the work you do, the industry, or how we do the work, what would that be that would be helpful?
I think overall the industry, in terms of like social work in general, this is hard because I feel like there's a couple things I would say, but if I had to choose one, I would say the access to the care. That's probably just in general overall. I don't think mental health or social work or anything, it doesn't get it's not as hyped as like a doctor who's a surgeon, right? Like the work doesn't seem as important almost to certain people.
Do you think it's because it's harder to quantify?
Probably.
Because like if you have something wrong with your heart.
Yes. You can go to the cardiologist, all that stuff.
They do something, the surgery, they fix the valve, whatever it is.
Yes.
And he's still alive. He's going to make it another, however many years, most likely, if he continues to eat right and all that stuff. But with your work, you might see a kid at point A and they may spend a year and a half at point A before they get to B because there's so much work that has to be done.
Yeah. So there's stages to it.
Yeah. So here's a question I have, though, because I think this is probably the most interesting thing for me, kind of sitting in my role and watching social workers and mental health professionals work. Why is it that you guys, on average, from my perspective, right, it's not everybody thinks this, but why don't you guys take as much care of yourselves as you do to the people you're providing care for?
Oh my goodness. I had a feeling you were going to ask this question.
I gave you the sheet before we got here.
Why don't we? Probably because it's easier to preach rather than practice. When they say practice what you preach, I would say it's easier to. It's also like saying, okay, so therapists are never supposed to work with like family and friends, right? And they say that because you're going to have a bias. It's much easier to work with someone and tell them exactly what they could do to change their behaviors. But it's also much harder for them to start practicing it. So it's like the same thing with us.
So how many therapists have therapists?
Every single one. I've had one.
You've had one.
I probably should go back.
How long should someone be in therapy? Because sometimes you hear people that are in therapy forever and they seem to be completely fine and operate in the world okay. And some people go and then they stop. Mm-hmm. I think one part because the therapist has said, okay, you've achieved whatever it was you were looking for. And then they're fine. And sometimes they go back, like as you mentioned. But how do you know when to stop? Or is it beneficial to never stop, even if you've addressed certain things?
I think it could go both ways. It really just depends on the person. So, like, just personally, like, I stopped when I felt like I had the tools to cope with my anxiety every single day. Because it was, like, becoming, like, physical symptoms where I was like, oh, my God, like, why am I nauseous every single day? So I think it's what goals the patient or the client wants to really achieve. And they kind of navigate that, especially like that's how I am. Like I very much let the client say that for themselves. So like if someone unless it's like 2 weeks in and they're like, I'm fixed. I'm like, hold on, wait. So let's bring it back. Why do you feel that way? Why do you think that? What have we done so far? What are you taking away? So you really have to evaluate those things. But I do think it just really depends on the client.
I think the other part of this is probably you guys don't know how to say no.
Yes.
And why is that?
I think by nature, all therapists, social workers, licensed professional counselors, helping professionals are empathetic to a fault. And I think it's hard I think we probably all struggle with being people pleasers deep down. And I think a lot of people, something that they say in graduate school or when you're going to school for social work is like, you're kind of here for a reason. And most people start the work to navigate something for themselves. Like I could definitely say that about myself. You know what I mean? Like I didn't go into the work just because like I always knew I wanted to help people, but I also knew that like there was things that happened to me that I wanted to understand more.
So you were kind of going to address your own issues and learn how to work through those things on your own and then
be able to flip it to then help other people.
Yeah. So it wasn't necessarily social work that you were looking for, but that just happened to be an avenue.
Basically, like I went to undergrad for psychology and I didn't really know exactly what I wanted to do. I know I wanted to work with people. So I was like, maybe I'll be a teacher. I really like kids. And I couldn't really figure out exactly what I wanted to do. And then a friend actually called me a year after we graduated and was like, going back to school for social work. And I was like, maybe I'll do that with you. And then that's kind of how I fell into the field, really. So it was like a really good friend kind of like being like, I know you could do this. And I think we should do it together. Cause it's like always nice having someone else that you know in grad school. But she was really like, you would be a really great social worker. And I think like you would thrive in this space. So here I am.
Here you are. But if you weren't here and you weren't a social worker, what would you be doing?
I would say I'd probably be like in the journalism world. I really like to write, and I like investigating things. So I feel like I would go into investigative journalism.
Investigative journalism. Do you have the heart for investigative
Probably
journalism?
not, but that's why I didn't go into the field. But
well, now it's time for us to get to know you a little better.
ooh.
This is our Blitz round where we ask some personal questions.
Okay.
But they're not very invasive. But we could go deeper if we figure out an angle. What's your favorite color?
My favorite color is yellow.
Yellow.
Mm-hmm.
Why?
I just always liked the color, but you'll never see me wear it. It's
never.
No.
She's always in black.
Never
Black
see me
and
wear
gray.
it. It's never like it was never the color of my walls growing up. I just like always liked the color.
Interesting.
I feel like my aura is yellow. That's why.
Yeah, I think I know the answer to this question. If there was one food in the world, what would you be eating every day?
Oh, sour cream and onion chips.
More than steak?
Oh, besides that.
Oh, okay. Because chips aren't food.
No, but that's like my favorite all-time snack.
Really?
Yeah, like if me and Chris are in an argument, if he brings me those chips, we're usually fine.
Oh, Chris is the
my fiance.
The fiance. And what would Chris say about Kimberly?
He would probably say that I am like I was gonna say like a Sour Patch Kid, but I'm not too like sassy like that. Maybe I am with him, but I think he would say that I'm like empathetic to a fault, or like that I could have better boundaries. I think he would say that. So
the fiance, so the soon-to-be husband, when is the date?
There is no date yet. We're navigating if we want to elope or have a big wedding.
Oh, okay. Mm-hmm. I'd say do both, in my opinion, but does that matter? So when you and Chris are Netflixing and chilling, what's your favorite TV show?
Oh, well, that depends, because if I'm watching with Chris, we're not watching reality TV. Okay. Because he does not. Only Love is Blind. That's all he'll watch. He thinks everything else I watch is garbage. But if we're watching, right now we're watching, we just finished Severance, which was really, really
Very good show.
And we're also currently watching Paradise on Hulu.
I didn't start that yet.
That's really good too. Well, we're only on like the third episode, but we like things like that. Yeah. Like, or Gordon Ramsay cooking shows.
Gordon Ramsay cooking. So because basically every streaming platform just fall under Netflix and chill. Like it's like a term now, right? Yeah. It's almost like Googling for television. What's your favorite movie?
10 Things I Hate About You.
Favorite vacation spot?
Probably Miami, because my family is from there.
If you could go one place in the world you've never been, where would it be?
I would really love to go to Amsterdam.
Why?
Just Europe. And my friends have been there and said that I would really like the culture there.
Interesting. Mm-hmm. If you could meet anyone alive or dead, who would it be?
Oh, alive or dead? Can I do both?
Sure.
These are both artists that I really like. So I would say alive, Demi Lovato, my favorite singer. And probably passed away would be Mac Miller.
Oh, yeah. That was early. That was too early. Do you have a role model?
My sister.
Sister?
Yeah.
I don't think I've met her, have I?
No.
Oh, why is she your role model?
Just because she's the most resilient person I've ever met.
Interesting. That's a loaded response, so we won't go too deep into it because she's not here to talk about herself. And your favorite holiday?
Besides my birthday, Christmas.
Birthday's not a holiday.
It's a holiday to me.
But Christmas. I love Christmas too. But let me see what else I've got here. I've got a few more. Your hometown is?
Secaucus, New Jersey.
Your favorite city in New Jersey?
Newark.
That was the right answer. It's where I'm from. It's where we are. Pepsi or Coca-Cola?
Coke. 100%.
Favorite ice cream?
Okay. If I'm going to the ice cream store that I grew up going to in Secaucus, there is, and shout out Uncle D's in Secaucus. I used to work there growing up.
There's the Secaucus accent coming out there too.
There is a coconut almond joy, and I don't know if they still make it, but that is so good. And it's a homemade ice cream store. They make all that ice cream in there. But if not, then I'm like a pretty basic, like vanilla gal.
Are you into sports?
I am.
Which sports?
I like that. Mostly basketball, football.
Okay. And your teams are?
I'm a Boston Celtics fan.
Okay.
And
Classic.
I'm a Philadelphia Eagles fan.
Are you really a Philadelphia Eagles fan?
I am a Philadelphia Eagles fan by marriage.
By marriage. By Bucka, as he's called, a.k.a. Chris. If we were able to talk to your friends without you around, what would they tell us about you?
My friends?
Yes.
Ooh, I am still friends with all of my girls from like elementary school,
Okay.
like all the way into high school. We're all still friends. They would say that the person you see today is not the person who I once was growing up. Probably much less angry, they would say.
Oh, really?
Yeah. I was a very angry, emotional kid and teenager.
I've heard some of these stories.
Mm-hmm.
And how many social workers does it take to screw in a light bulb?
Probably all of them. We are a team-based profession.
Team-based professional. Thank you so much, Kim. This was
Thank you.
Wonderful pleasure. And we look forward to more exciting episodes here in the Great Futures Force. This is number 5. Our first real team member spotlight. We had that bald guy, Dave Kelly, on. That was like an alumni spotlight. And we'll see you next time. Thank you for tuning in. And make sure you take care of yourself. Take care of other people. Understand that everybody's different. Everybody's arriving at a different place based on where they come from. No one's perfect. And in the words of the great Denzel Washington, you can't legislate love. And so we have to figure out how to arrive at the same place together based on the goals that we have and make sure that we're not hurting people mentally, emotionally, physically as we're getting to the places we're going. So live and let live. Take care of yourself. Don't be afraid of therapy. It is not a dirty word. Everyone can use therapy at some place or another. And not having a professional doesn't mean you don't have somebody that's a trusted individual that you can talk to, unload your problems, don't hold things in, because we don't need any more explosions in the world. See you later. Until next time, take care of each other.